You are listening to the Mother of All Talk Shows podcast with George Galloway.
Global warming. Take a look at that picture of central London. Look out your window if you're in Britain as they tell us about this baking hot summer in the United Kingdom. Not likely, according to the vast majority of British people. We in the Workers' Party have demanded a referendum in Britain on whether or not to continue the commitment to a net zero economy by 2050. And the signs are that everyone from Lawrence Fox and Tony Blair are backing the central demand of ours, that this net zero scam will basically condemn the British economy and British people to a cold penury for no good reason. And that's why I'm running this poll this evening. Is the global warming net zero cult a scam? You can answer yes or no on my Twitter, on my Telegram, t.me/George Galloway, on the YouTube community poll, and on the YouTube stream that many of you are watching now. If you haven't yet subscribed to my YouTube channel, please do so and like the show if indeed you do like it. And I'm confident that you're going to like it tonight. We have a panel almost like no other, and we have pretty good panels. Well, the Kiev regime has landed bombs on the financial district in the center of Moscow. As Ambassador Craig Murray put it on Twitter just a few minutes ago, whilst that may be legal, it's definitely not wise. And the Russian response is likely to be very robust indeed. In the last 48 hours, the Kiev regime has bombed a museum and coffee shop in Rostov, and now landing drones, explosive, suicide, kamikaze drones in the center of Moscow. It will not be long before we see the Russian response. The much vaunted Ukrainian counter-offensive, first designated for the spring and then the summer, hasn't really got off the ground. So a resort to spectacular acts of what many would call individual acts of terrorism is the next, perhaps the last throw of the dice for the Kiev regime. But the course of the war now seems set, and its ending will either be at a negotiated table or it will be on the battlefield. Either way, it will not stop, I am sure, until the aims of the special military operation have been achieved. And those aims, of course, have expanded as the atrocity, like the one committed in Moscow in the last few hours, continue to rain down. If the special military operation had stopped when it could have stopped just a month or two into it, if it was not scuppered by Boris Johnson at the behest of Joe Biden, then the terms of the settlement might have been entirely palatable for the vast majority of Ukrainian citizens. Now, after 522 days, the terms of the settlement will be much more condown and will surely include the liberation of Odessa, the landlocking of the stump state of Western Ukraine by the taking of the entire southern Black Sea coastline of Ukraine, and the liberation of the ethnically Russian people of Transnistria. And that includes the Russian jewel of Odessa. Odessa is a very fascinating place. I've been studying it quite substantially just in the last few days. Do you know that in 1941, when the Nazi and Romanian armed forces occupied Odessa as part of Operation Barbarossa in 1941, there were more than 150,000 Jews living in Odessa. It was a Russian Jewish city. By the time the Red Army liberated Odessa in 1944, there were fewer than 5,000 Jews left in the city. I don't need to spell out to you what happened to all the others. In fact, this lash-up of Japan and Germany and Italy and Romania in this current war against Russia is so redolent of historic significance. It is amazing that not a single commentator, academic, still less member of the British Parliament or any of the other parliaments in Western Europe at least, can even bring themselves to comment on it. The idea that Russia is now confronted with precisely the same state alliance, axis we used to call it, is so obscene, so grotesque, you would have thought that it would have entered the discourse of any sensible person, considering the potential course and outcome of this war in Ukraine. But it does not. Romania is now one of the principal bases for the NATO attack on Russia, which is clearly intending to break up, to balkanize, to fragment the Russian Federation. Nobody mentions that it was the German Reich with their Romanian allies who committed such atrocities in the Holocaust in the East. But then, how could they mention it? How could we justify recreating the axis that caused the deaths of 26 million people in Russia and the wider Soviet Union in the years 1941 to 1945? Best that we sweep that under the carpet. Well, Russia will respond, I've no doubt, to the Rostov and Moscow attacks, maybe even while we are on the air. And if they do, we'll bring these developments to you. But let me turn my attention to Washington. The circus around the Hunter Biden-Joe Biden affair sure ain't funny. It's true there are many clowns in play in that circus, but the story they are bringing us is dark indeed. Just ponder this. Why did Barack Obama allow Joe Biden complete control over America's Ukraine policy when he was the vice president? Unless there are no intelligence services in the United States, they must have known and told President Obama everything that Joe Biden and Hunter Biden and the Biden crime family were doing in Ukraine. But Barack Obama allowed it to continue. And what has it now brought us? It has brought us the corruption, final corruption of the American Republic itself. The Russiagate hoax, which was in part predicated on the United States' deceitful entanglement in Ukraine. The impeachment of President Trump for demanding answers to what the Bidens were doing in Ukraine. The corruption of the American justice system that we have seen played out this week in the attempt to hoodwink a federal judge into granting immunity to Hunter Biden, into crimes far more serious than the ones that he intended to plead guilty to. The corruption of the First Amendment of the American Constitution. They would not have had to corrupt the social media companies. They didn't have to do much work to do so. It's true. The door was open. But they corrupted the First Amendment of the American Constitution itself by a state corporate lash-up to conspire against the freedom of speech, thought, even assembly of the American people, guaranteed under the First Amendment to the Constitution. And not only has it begotten this total corruption of American democracy, it has begotten a war with the Russian Federation, which could turn out to be World War III, all to cover up Joe Biden's crimes in the Ukraine, all to cover up the corrupt nexus of the Biden crime family, the Ukrainian oligarchs, and a succession of Ukrainian puppet politicians. It doesn't get much more serious than all of that. It's a big question why the American public are putting up with that. But it's a bigger question why the European governments on our behalf are going along with it. It's one thing, your sons dying for Kupiansk and what side of the line it's going to be. It's another thing doing so under the leadership of Joe Biden and Mitch McConnell and Nancy Pelosi, a collection of gerontocratic leaders that make Chernenko and Brezhnev look like mere striplings. People who have mental health episodes on screen at a press conference are leading the governments of the once proud continent of Europe over a cliff for American interests, self-harming, maybe even committing economic and political suicide in our own countries to follow the diktat of Joe Biden. Meanwhile, Russia and China, for that matter, are going from strength to strength. They are demonstrating daily the tectonic shift in the plates. They are demonstrating daily the new friends and the consolidation of old with new friends that are lining up alongside them. Putin called an Africa summit in St. Petersburg this week. It was attended by 49 countries, heads of state, deputy heads of state. Thousands of delegates from Africa were in Russia. They weren't in London, and they certainly weren't in Paris, about which more in a moment. When President Putin reeled off the list of African heroes, Patrice Lumumba, Kenneth Kaunda, Joseph Nyerere, Nelson Mandela, Kwame Nkrumah, he was rolling off a list. Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, he was rolling off a list of Russia's closest historical allies on the continent of Africa. People that Russia supported and the West murdered or overthrew, subverted, conspired against, destroyed. Do you see where I'm going here? These old friends of Russia are joined by new friends, like the magnificent 35-year-old president of Burkina Faso, a man so powerful and eloquent and handsome. Well, he made Mitch McConnell look, well, like a fossil. And when the president of Burkina Faso said no one should pity a slave who does not rebel, this resounded through the African continent. And he called on the African countries to have some dignity, to stand up for themselves and to stand with those countries that stood with them, rather than the countries that did everything they could to enslave enchain and bind forever in economic slavery the countries of Africa. And the African people overwhelmingly believe that. And no sooner was the summit ended, but a case in point was demonstrated. The corrupt puppet regime in Niger, uranium-rich Niger, was overthrown by a movement of its own people and its own armed forces. Nothing to do with us. Nothing to do with the United States. Nothing to do with France. 80% of every light in Paris this evening is lit by the resources of the people of Niger. But only 20% of the people of Niger have even got electricity. You'd think the French would be too embarrassed to comment. But they're not just commenting. Little Macron, I was going to call him Little Napoleon, but he doesn't deserve to be in the same sentence as Napoleon. Little Macron has threatened the people of Niger to reinstate their puppet president so he can continue to loot the country in the interests of France. And Antony Blinken has backed him. Antony Blinken demanded the reinstatement of the corrupt puppet president of Niger. I mean, I don't want to swear on air, but who is Antony Blinken to decide who rules Niger? And if you were in any doubt as to whose benefit and disbenefit this overthrow of the Niger government might be, you already know the answer in the attitude of France and the attitude of the United States to the coup. So I know nothing about the new leadership in Niger, but they're all right by me if they can make Macron and Blinken so very, very angry. We'll be talking about these shifting tectonic plates and about one of the most surprising turns of events, the coming of North Korea, the DPRK, and its leader Kim Jong-un in from the cold. You never thought you'd hear me say that, did you? Fasten your seatbelts. It's the mother of all talk shows.
You are listening to the Mother of All Talk Shows podcast with George Galloway.
Dr. George Szamuely is the premier academic in the eastern part of Europe, the central part of Europe, and one of our most popular guests. He's never once been on here without imparting wisdom that was precious as well as popular. And it's a great privilege to welcome him back onto the Mother of All Talk Shows again. Dr. George, thank you for joining us. Let's start with the dramatic developments in Moscow. What could possibly go wrong now that Kiev is landing bombs in the center of Moscow?
Well, what indeed? Well, obviously, Ukraine is desperate for escalating this war because ultimately the only way it can hope to prevail is through U.S. military intervention. And so that's obviously what it's going for as it launches these attacks on Moscow or wherever. It's clearly hoping for some kind of a major escalation on Russia's part that could provoke Washington to do something. I don't think that would work. However, there is a real danger that Washington could yet be provoked into getting directly involved. I don't think it's so much the these sort of terrorist attacks on Russian cities, but more through the activities of Poland. Poland has become the rabid dog of Europe and is very anxious to provoke some kind of an incident with Russia in the hope of, again, triggering NATO's famous Article 5. So an attack on Poland is an attack on all, and therefore everyone must go to war on Poland's behalf. So I think that's probably at the moment where the greatest danger lies in terms of direct NATO intervention.
Let me detain you on that point. It is one of the greatest historical ironies, is it not, that the Banderaite regime in Kiev, which collaborated. Bandera was the right-hand man of the SS and the Einsatzgruppen, who massacred well over 1 million people in the Holocaust of the East. Many of them, most of them, Polish. That the Polish government is now in double harness with the supporters of, the descendants of, those who mass murdered Poles. How's that for an axis?
It is an extraordinary event because, of course, as you say, the massacres in Volhynia were absolutely horrific. But the strange thing about Poland, and I don't claim to be, to understand this wholly, is that the Polish hatred towards Russia is far more intense than its hatred towards Germany. I mean, it does hate the Germans, but nothing to the extent that it hates the Russians. And by the same token, it doesn't hate the Ukrainians anything with the intensity that it hates the Russians. Now, one should also say that the Poles treated the Ukrainians very badly during the late 1930s, during the forced Polonization campaign. I mean, Poland seized this territory from Russia in 1919, 1920, while Russia was absolutely preoccupied with the Civil War. So Russia was forced to sign this agreement, the Treaty of Riga, 1921. So Poland grabbed itself a big chunk of territory and treated the inhabitants very badly, which I think contributed to the subsequent bad treatment that was meted out to the Poles. But nonetheless, the extraordinary thing is that Poland has this animus towards Russia, and then Putin pointed out correctly is that yes, Poland lost some territory in the east, but it was more than compensated by huge rewards of territory in the west, the parts of East Prussia and West Prussia and so on. So Poland should be rather grateful to the Soviet Union for essentially restoring a big country after World War II, not to mention the fact that the Soviet Union liberated Poland from Nazism. But nonetheless, the Poles absolutely loathe the Russians with an intensity far greater than the Germans, the ones who actually enslaved Poland. It's a mystery, and I don't fully understand it myself.
I attended an event in Poland, in Warsaw, in the last day or so. And it became clear to me that there are actually rather a lot of Polish people who don't approve of their country being dragooned, and it's willingly being dragooned by the political leaders, into being the spearhead against Russia. They think that no good can come of it. And moreover, there's a real fear that martial law will be declared in Poland, at least in part of Poland, and that will be used to cancel the upcoming elections in the country. What can you tell us about that?
Well, that's a distinct possibility because Poland right now is whipping up an extraordinary fervor against Russia. It's pretty much like, they're moving onto a war footing. They've escalated their military spending. It's, I think, something like 5% of GDP, so well over what anyone demanded of NATO. It's getting all of its arms from the United States, so it's not even bothering with the EU defense industry. And they've told the United States that we are your strongest, your most loyal ally in Europe. Forget old Europe, forget Germany, forget France. They're weak, insipid, decadent. They did all these terrible deals with Putin. We are the strongest, though. We are the most vigorous part of Europe, and we will be, your foot soldiers in the coming war against Russia. It's an extraordinarily belligerent rhetoric that's coming out of Warsaw. But you're right. I mean, I talk to Poles as well, who are very sensible, very reasonable, who don't want to get dragged into the stupid war. But Poland's leaders are not like that. So whether it's Donald Tusk, or whether it's Radek Sikorski, or whether it's Morawiecki, or Kaczynski, the leaders, they are all absolutely demented in their anti-Russian hatred.
Now, leaving aside the Eastern European theatre for a moment, though, I'd like to come back to it. These were extraordinary scenes in St. Petersburg over the last few days, weren't they? No one could have expected this African Renaissance to be picking up the momentum that it has, and the closeness of African countries now to Russia and China is quite extraordinary, isn't it?
Absolutely. And it's very interesting that Putin brought up the names that you mentioned, Ben Bella, Nasser, Nkrumah, Lumumba, Samora Machel. And he actually said that, the Soviet Union did a great deal to liberate the peoples of Africa, a great deal to fight against colonialism, neo-colonialism, great deal to fight against apartheid. And then he said, at the time, this wasn't really that popular a policy within the Soviet Union, because people were feeling, well, why are you giving all this stuff to Africans? Well, we could use some of this ourselves. But then he says, well, actually, the Soviet Union made a very sound investment, because now, decades later, these Africans come to us and they are very grateful to us and are very well disposed towards us, and want to help us precisely because of that long record of Soviet assistance to Africa during those decades. And it's very interesting that Gorbachev, who kind of tossed away the Soviet Union, the Soviet legacy, and everything, over a kind of a boozy lunch with Helmut Kohl, didn't really realize he had so absorbed the Western view of the Soviet Union. He didn't realize that for much of the rest of the world, they didn't see the Soviet Union in the same way. They didn't see it in this sort of communism, anti-communism paradigm. They saw the Soviet Union as a positive force. And I think Gorbachev and the people around it didn't realize that by tossing away the Soviet legacy, they actually did a lot of harm, a lot of damage to the rest of the world. And this was a point emphasized by the president of Eritrea, who gave a very long presentation in front of Putin, and was very critical of Gorbachev and the Soviet leaders around him, that you tossed all this aside and you left us in the lurch. We looked to you for assistance and you left us in the lurch, and that maybe Russia now is actually coming back to that the Soviet tradition of assistance to the African people.
Well, the Russians are back, but the French are on their way out. I was looking at a map today of the African countries that have literally kicked France out. And now Macron is threatening war. And as we speak, the French embassy in Niger is on fire.
Yes, it's very interesting. And it's interesting how the Western media presented it, because the Western media declared that, this African summit in St. Petersburg is a big flop because only 21 heads of state showed up. It doesn't really matter because everybody showed up. I mean, there was no one, if the West had its way, no one would have showed up. In fact, everybody showed up to the summit. But at the same time, the media have to acknowledge that one after another, the African countries are getting rid of the so-called pro-Western regimes, and they're replacing them with governments that are hostile to France, hostile to the United States, and well disposed towards Russia. So it's we're talking about Niger, but what about Mali? That also had a change of government recently. Burkina Faso, Chad. It's a whole series of them, and in Sudan, it's a clean sweep across Western and Central Africa. And these so-called pro-Western regimes are being thrown aside. So, but let's remember, a lot of it is also the consequence of the Western intervention in Libya, which completely destabilized the region, unleashed Islamic terrorists. So the whole Sahel region was destroyed as a result of that, the attack on Gaddafi. And then we had this, war against Islamists. And as usual, the Americans come in. They don't really do anything. They just simply take the country over, pretend that they're fighting against Islamists. And essentially, these governments have now said, we've had enough. You're not actually doing anything. You're actually weakening us every day. We're losing this war against the Islamists. You need to go, stop giving us this assistance. We can actually do a much better job against Islamic terrorism without United States and without France. And I think that's really what's contributed to this clean sweep of regimes that have fallen in the last few months.
Finally, and I'm grateful for your time, Doctor, let me go back to the European theatre. There's intense speculation about the Wagner Group, about Prigozhin, who turned up at the St. Petersburg summit, interestingly, and his forces, which are now in Belarus. There's speculation about Russian-Belarusian creation of a corridor to Russian territory that is effectively separated by a land corridor. I think it's the Suwalki corridor they are talking about, to reinforce it, to guard it. And equally, going back to Poland and your earlier point, there's intense speculation that the Polish army will enter Western Ukraine. That would be an act of war against Belarus and Russia, would it not?
Yes, no question. I mean, Poland is now kicking up a huge fuss about the Wagner Group and the Suwalki corridor, and that somehow there's a threat from the Wagner Group to enter Poland. So that could certainly be a danger. I mean, Poland could certainly attack Belarus, saying, "Hey, we're under threat from the Wagner Group." So I think that there's no question that's, again, one of the possible ways in which this could escalate into World War III. The Western Ukraine is certainly a possibility if Poland and Ukraine forge some kind of a political union. And I think that's much more likely than just Poland entering unilaterally. But, they've already talked in the past about creating some kind of a union state. And then if they do actually create some sort of a confederation of Poland and Ukraine, then, of course, Poland can enter Ukraine. And again, that could well be a trigger for World War III. This is clearly the plan. I mean, we know that Poland and Ukraine are working in tandem to escalate this into an Article 5 situation. I mean, it happened that time with the so-called missile that landed in Poland. Remember, Poland and Ukraine both proclaimed that this was an attack on Polish territory when they knew perfectly well that it wasn't. So it wasn't just Ukraine saying it. Poland also said we were under attack from Russia. So Poland and Ukraine are in on it together. But again, I think there's a real possibility that Poland and Ukraine will work out some sort of a confederation, and that in effect makes Ukraine a de facto member of NATO. So I think that's a real possibility. The Wagner Group, however, I mean, the fact that Prigozhin was at this St. Petersburg summit, well, the Wagner Group is, unlike the Americans, actually gets the job done in Africa. They have been far more effective in defeating ISIS than the Americans. I mean, the Americans in Africa, as in Syria, they actually don't do anything. They don't actually fight the Islamists. They actually just simply occupy territory, undermine, destabilize governments, but they don't actually get the job done of fighting the Islamists. The Wagner Group did do that, which is, I think, why again, many of these African leaders are well disposed towards the Wagner Group.
You and I have talked about Article 5 before. It doesn't actually mean what most commentators pretend that it means. But in the case of Poland entering, into Ukraine, that definitely wouldn't trigger Article 5. Because if Russia fought Poland in Western Ukraine, it's not fighting Poland, which is a member of NATO. It's fighting this new Hydra-headed entity that may or may not be formed between Poland and Western Ukraine.
No, there are all sorts of ways in which Poland is going to try and get around it and say, well, this involves Article 5. But as you say, Article 5 does not oblige everyone to go to war. Should a state come under attack, it just simply obliges all NATO member states to decide what, if anything, they're willing to do about it. But more important than Article 5 is Article 1. Article 1 obliges every NATO member state to resolve all issues with non-NATO member states by exclusively peaceful means. Article 1 supersedes Article 5. Well, Poland hasn't remotely sought to resolve its conflicts with Russia, a non-NATO member state, by peaceful means. And on the contrary, Poland has gone out of its way to provoke a war with Russia. So there's no way that Poland can try and invoke Article 5. We're under attack. We weren't doing nothing, so please come and help us. There's just no way that Poland can make that case.
Dr. George, quite brilliant as always. Thanks for joining us on the mother of all talk shows. Is the global warming net zero cult a scam? You have your say, yes or no. I've got to tell you that so far it is 92 yes, 85 yes, 91 yes, and 90 yes. 12,363 people have voted. If you've got a point of view, please register it on our poll right now. Quick break, and then I'll be right back.
You are listening to the Mother of All Talk Shows podcast with George Galloway.
Now, I was going to say that Jackson Hinkle comes fresh from an altercation with Piers Morgan, but nobody really emerges fresh from an altercation with Piers Morgan. It was toxic, but Jackson Hinkle took him to the cleaners, as we say in Glasgow. And I'm glad to say, for a celebratory lap of honour, it's the one and only Jackson Hinkle who joins us now. Jackson, what was it like sitting metaphorically in a studio with Rupert Murdoch's mouthpiece, Piers Morgan?
Well, it was quite something. I don't watch a lot of Piers Morgan, I have to admit, but to start off a conversation about the most pressing geopolitical crisis in the world right now and belittle it by calling the opposing side in this debate, myself, a Putin fanboy, it's just laughable. And I think people saw right through it. The debate on his own YouTube channel, he's got millions of followers, and the vast majority, I think it was by a factor of 4 times, people disliked his video. And it's because if there's one thing worse than, I guess, hypothetically being a Putin fanboy, as he called me, it's probably to be a Zelensky fanboy.
Well, Piers is Piers Morgan fanboy. And of course, he moves according to the wind. You're a young man, so let me educate you in this. He was our number one ally in the British media against the war on Iraq. He disbelieved everything that the state claimed about the case for invading and occupying Iraq. but he now believes every word of the state case for the war against Russia and the destruction of the Ukrainian people in that vainglorious inglorious bid. You were only on there because they're having to acknowledge that actually in your country and in mine, there's rather a lot of people would prefer Putin as their leader than Joe Biden or Rishi Sunak. Isn't that right?
Yeah, it's 100% correct. And for you to say that Pierce used to be an ally on subjects such as the Iraq war, I mean, it's just baffling to me because I don't even think he knows what he believes in, and that's why I have to thank people like you who are sincere and honest truth tellers and have been for so long. Because I asked Pierce a simple question. I said, Pierce, if you look at your own Twitter account, from February 24th, 2022 onward, there's countless tweets about Ukraine and how he prays for Ukrainians and the atrocities of Putin against the Ukrainian civilians. But if you look before February 24th, 2022, there's not a single tweet about the 15,000 people that were slaughtered in the Donbass, the primarily ethnic Russians killed at behest of NATO by the Ukrainian Nazi government. And in fact, there was one tweet about Zelensky prior to February 24th, 2022. And Piers Morgan was making fun of the comedian with no political experience having risen to the prominence of president of Ukraine. So he was actually making fun of him back then. But it just goes to show that when I asked him the question, why did you not tweet about the Ukrainian deaths prior to February 24, 2022? And he was silent. In fact, he handed the question off to his other Zelensky fanboy he had in the studio with him. I think it proves that so many of these talking heads in the mainstream press, they simply don't believe anything. They are nothing more than, as I just put it, talking heads regurgitating whatever the CIA or the State Department or MI6 have to tell them about matters like Ukraine.
Yes, they live under the dictatorship of the prevailing orthodoxy, but it's particularly sad in Piers's case because he didn't do that in the run-up to the Iraq war. And I counted him as a friend then and for many years thereafter. But as Elvis Costello said, somebody needs to put out the big light. I can't bear to see him this way. But you actually trounced him in the debate because you're a very, very brilliant young man. So much so, you're now an ambassador. And I want to ask you about that. It is quite something that North Korea, for so long shunned by East and West, let's face it, the Chinese and the Russians were nominally allied with North Korea, but they kept it at arm's length. But Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, was given a rock star welcome in Pyongyang this week. And it's quite obvious to me, reading the lines and between the lines, that North Korea is about to move quite significantly into, if you like, the new world that is being formed by this UN reconfiguration of the planet. And you are volunteering to be a goodwill ambassador, and good for you being a goodwill ambassador, because why should we be enemies of North Korea?
We shouldn't be. We shouldn't be. And I think many people across the world understand all the good that Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-un have done for the world. Kim Jong-un is a peace-seeking leader, despite what, the talking heads, again, at CNN and Fox News and MSNBC say about him. They make him sound like some insane, tyrannical, authoritarian, bloodthirsty tyrant that can do nothing right in the world. But when you actually look at videos of Westerners, Australians, UK citizens, anyone who travels to the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, you see something that's actually exactly opposite to what Hollywood portrays in the movies of North Korea. And you begin to understand that what Donald Trump was trying to do, strike a peace deal with North Korea and begin to normalize relations with North Korea, is actually a good, necessary step, because Russia and China understand that, like Africa, North Korea is a part of this new world, this new formation, this new century that we're living in. And they are people just like us, created by God, and we should be working with them to industrialize the world, create a more peaceful world, and a more hopeful world for all of our nations.
Well, I've been there twice. I haven't met Kim Jong-un, but I've been to North Korea twice, and it is a very fascinating place, unique society. And I hope that you have success in your attempts to foster more goodwill. But I can't show any goodwill towards Joe Biden, I must tell you. As I look at the circus in Washington and see the consequence, I mean, it may have started out just as a grift for the Bidens to make a pile for the future after Joe left the White House as vice president to President Obama. But look what it's turned into. It has corrupted the U.S. Constitution, and it has begotten a war. And now they're trying to arrest Hunter Biden's business partner before he can get to Congress tomorrow to give evidence of the Biden crime family's activities. Will they succeed in that, or will we hear from him tomorrow?
I guess we'll have to wait and see. But if recent history is any indication for how this is all going to unfold, let's just take a look at the U.S. judicial system and how the prosecutors in New York and D.C. truly operate. Because Donald Trump has been, given a litany of charges for crimes that I think a bunch of Americans would dispute the validity of. And all the while, Donald Trump has been charged left and right. It seems like every other week he's getting arrested now. We still have none of the Jeffrey Epstein associates who have been held accountable for their crimes. We have SBF of FTX, who looks like he's going to get off the hook for his crimes. And as you just mentioned, they're now trying to do this and protect Hunter Biden and ultimately protect Joe Biden, who is in this fanatical war craze, clamoring for World War III with Russia, just in an effort, I don't know, maybe to protect what he did at this point with Burisma Holdings Group and what they were doing with Hunter Biden with Burisma. And another part of this that a lot of people forget is Hunter Biden was not only involved with Burisma Holdings in Ukraine, but he also was a massive, massive investor for a lot of these U.S.-operated biolabs, former Soviet weapons labs in Ukraine. And he was getting special approval from the DOD while Joe Biden was vice president overseeing U.S.-Ukrainian relations. There's a lot of suspect stuff here. And I think the Burisma payment of $83,000 a month to Hunter Biden is just the tip of the iceberg.
Now, of course, the man who allowed the Bidens to run Ukraine was Obama. Because he looked cool in a tan suit and did a passable Sam Cooke from the stage in Chicago when he was first elected, a lot of people cut him a lot of slack, far more than they ought. But I'm wondering why this week we have a situation where the second Obama chef dies by drowning. Obama and his wife go playing tennis in a ritzy country club not 48 hours after the death by drowning in their garden of their 7-year employee. And Barack is wearing plasters on his hand and sporting a black eye. I'm wondering why that is not the biggest story in America right now. Why?
Well, that's the exact behavior of someone who simply doesn't care about the death of their longtime friend and chef. And it's so in your face at this point. Yes, the question must be asked, why is no one talking about this? And I think the last phone call you had with one of your guests summarizes what so many are thinking, at the end of the day, Joe Biden is not polling very high right now, especially when you put him head to head against Donald Trump, even in the Rust Belt and the swing states of the United States, which are so critical for winning a presidential election. And I think a lot of people understand that the Democratic Party would love to see someone like Michelle Obama run for office, run for president of the United States to replace Joe Biden, who's sputtering out on his last fumes right now. And, you got to clean up a few untied ends if you're going to run for president of the United States and you have as much dirt on you as I'm sure the Obamas do. So it's not to say that they're guilty, but when you look at these photos that are up by my face on the screen right now, I mean, you have Obama walking around with what appears to be a black eye. He's got presumably cuts on his fingers covered by medical tape. Where did that come from? And why are they so okay with the notion of just flaunting the fact that this looks extremely suspect and that they don't care?
Yeah, it would look extremely suspect if it were Donald Trump that had lost the second of his chefs and was playing golf 2 days later and with a black eye and wearing tape on his hand. Now, finally, Jackson, I'm grateful for your time. If it's not Obama, Mrs. Obama, not sure what her credentials would be, except being married to a former president. I suppose it's a 2-for-1, buy one, get one free, a way of Barack also to be back in the White House. If it's not them, it's going to be this California fellow, isn't it? This Gavin Newsom, about whom most people this side of the pond know very little. Can you enlighten us?
Yeah, he's someone who's got very high presidential ambitions, although I don't think he's going to be polling that high with the American public, given what has happened to California. George, I just moved out of Los Angeles because the situation has become so grim. I'm a California native. I grew up in Orange County. And I moved up to Los Angeles about 2.5 years ago. And it's just insane to see what has happened to our state, the most beautiful state in the union. And now it looks like a video game zombie wasteland. It's horrific. It's so sad. We have 600 to 700,000 homeless Americans. 10% of those are veterans who served our country abroad. Meanwhile, Joe Biden's sending $200 billion off to Ukraine, and Gavin Newsom, though he has no say on this because he's a governor of the state of California, I'm sure he applauds and supports all these ambitions of Biden to send more money to Ukraine when his own state is crumbling. Okay. Now, someone who's polling much higher is someone who actually, in the Democratic Party, who rejects the Democratic Party orthodoxy, is Robert F. Kennedy Jr. I have issues I disagree with him vehemently on, of course, and I'm sure you do as well, like on Israel, for example. But don't you think it's interesting to see someone who is so in opposition to the stated goals of the Democratic National Committee, the Democratic Party, and nearly all Democratic elected officials across the nation polling at 20% in the party? I don't think Gavin Newsom is going to win the Democratic nomination if he does, in fact, seek it. He's running ads in Florida right now. I've seen those. By virtue of his great ideas or his good looks, I think it will be a gerrymandering of the process, just like we saw with Hillary Clinton becoming the nominee back in 2016 when Bernie Sanders was polling so high.
And what can you make of President Biden refusing security detail from the state for Bobby Kennedy when actually the system of giving protection to people running for president only was invented after the murder of Bobby Kennedy's father? Who in the Democratic Party can support refusing protection for somebody called Robert Kennedy?
It seems like a weaponization of our own law enforcement agencies in the United States to try and stifle the success of his main political opponent within the Democratic Party. But then again, is it really that out of character for someone like Joe Biden, who has sicked big tech thugs on any and all opposition in the free and open media independent press? Is it really all that much of something that's out of character for someone like Joe Biden when he's sicking federal prosecutors on his main and number one opposition that's looking like it's going to beat him, that is Donald Trump in the Republican field? No, I don't think it is. And I think, frankly, as grim and dark as it is, Joe Biden would probably love to see Robert F. Kennedy Jr. end up like his own father or like his uncle, JFK, in their very, very sad and tragic demise.
Well, actually, given the record of the Secret Service in protecting Jack Kennedy and the original Robert Kennedy, it's maybe best if Bobby doesn't have recourse to them. Jackson Hinkle, you're a star man. Thanks for joining us on the mother of all talk shows. 15,779 people voted in the poll. Not bad. But 93% on Telegram considered the net zero a scam. 86% on Twitter considered it a scam. 91% on the YouTube community poll considered it a scam, and 90% on the YouTube stream. That tells me I'm onto something, that my party is onto something. Our demand for a net zero referendum is being piloted by one of our members, His Excellency Peter Ford, former British ambassador. He's doing the intellectual legwork on it. He's heading up that campaign for us, and he's the ideal man to do it. We already have the support of the Reclaim Party, and we hope as weeks go on that we'll get the support of many parties and ultimately the governing party, who must want to stop the bus and get off, because 2050 is just round the corner. And the price of net zero for Britain, which produces 0.04% of carbon emissions in the world, cannot be paid. You know the feeling when you see a bill or you get a price quoted at you and you feel bad. It's agonizing. If I pay that, I'll have to give up that and so on. No. This is a bill that literally cannot be paid by the British people, who've already been placed over a barrel by the energy price rises over this last 12 months. And the obscene profits being made by British gas, obscene levels of profits, whilst people are going cold, and 12 weeks from now will be cold again in the British winter time. We cannot afford to stop exploiting our oil and gas fields. We cannot afford to abandon nuclear power. We cannot afford not to have a balanced energy policy with all kinds of tributaries supplying energy to our people. We certainly can never re-industrialize our country on a net zero 2050 prospectus. And if we do not re-industrialize, what will we be? Who will we be? What kind of country could we possibly be if we do not retool, re-energize, and re-industrialize ourselves again? And if net zero was so worthy an objective, why do they keep their private jets whilst trying to tell us we cannot drive our cars except by paying through the nose in ULEZ, on the streets of London, now even outer London? How come you can't drive your car in outer London, but the oligarchs and the politicians can fly around in private jets? It's a bit like being told you can't go and visit your old mother, but the Prime Minister is having a party with his aides in Downing Street. The hypocrisy is off the scale. And this catastrophism, this apocalyptic vision which they paint, is simply not believable. John Kerry, who flies around in a private jet everywhere he goes, said in 2009 that in 5 years we will have the very first ever ice-free Arctic. It was a lie, or a prediction that not only didn't come true, but will never come true, has never come true. They're always telling us that if we don't give up this, if we don't pay this price, the consequence will be this catastrophe, this apocalypse. And I don't believe it. You may believe it, in which case let's have a referendum and compare your beliefs with mine. What we cannot do is go down quietly into that good night without even a proper two-sided debate on these questions and a democratic vote in a net zero referendum. These were my final thoughts. I've unfortunately overrun. It's been a wonderful show, I think, and I'm very glad that you kept me company through it. Well over 1 million people, again, 1.7 million people watched the mother of all talk shows in the last 7 days, but I'm still dying to get to that 2 million number again. Thanks very much indeed for your time. It's been marvelous for me. I hope it was for you, and I wish you all a very pleasant night.